Oh, Dr. Porges is there too.
All right, I've got it recording.
I want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon. This is a very exciting moment to share with all of you. And I've been kind of gleefully scrolling through and seeing folks and greeting them because many of you I know. And for Stephen, this is an introduction to some of the network that I have developed over time, the trauma-informed community. And people are really excited to hear us talk today. So just a couple things to get us started, a couple norms that I think will help facilitate this time together. The first one is that make certain that you are muted if you aren't currently, and that will help us with reducing ambient noise. The second thing is that I would love for people to um, practice radical acceptance when they hear someone saying, well, either Stephen or myself saying something that really deeply resonates for you. So the way in which I do this virtually is to either show thumbs up in your camera, to use your jazz hands, or to give us a little hang loose signal. So when you hear something that really resonates for you, I think it's helpful if we can see some gesticulation from others that, you know, this is something that's a shared theme or a shared notion for us. And then if you wouldn't mind, we're going to use the chat function so that we can, again, diminish the ambient noise. And Kristen, who is my co-moderator, is going to be helping me to kind of delineate questions that are coming through that appear to have some themes. So are we all, is everybody good with that? Can I see some thumbs up on these norms that folks feel good about those? Okay, great. So joining me today for my first conversation is no other than the creator of the polyvagal theory, the one and only Dr. Stephen Porges.
Thank you.
Who is an incredible human being. He's wise and generous researcher and scientist, and I've been incredibly grateful for his insight and his knowledge that he's shared with me personally and also through all of his communication mediums. It's my hope that this conversation will help to inform all of us in a way in which that's relevant to our time right now. I've never felt like the polyvagal is more than in this very moment in time. So I'm going to do a quick bio on Dr. Porges. He's the distinguished university scientist at Indiana University, where he's the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium in the Kinsey Institute. He's professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and professor emeritus at both the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the University of Maryland. He served as president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and is the former recipient of the National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Development Award. He has published more than 300 peer-reviewed papers across several disciplines that I have to read that include anesthesiology, biomedical engineering, critical care medicine, ergonomics, exercise physiology, gerontology, neurology, neuroscience, obstetrics, pediatrics, psychiatry, psychology, psychometrics, space medicine, and substance abuse. He's the originator of the polyvagal theory, a theory that emphasizes the importance of physiological state in the expression of behavioral, mental, and health problems related to traumatic experiences. And he's married to Sue Carter, who is the scientist that discovered the role that oxytocin plays in social bonds. So, welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you. Sue likes that, but she also likes to take credit for directing me into the world of social biology, or the relationship between social behavior and our neurobiology.
Yeah, I think it's you guys are a dynamic duo.
You know, she rescued me from the world of sustained attention and focusing on those processes to those that are more mammalian or social.
Yeah.
So I think
so it's awesome. So since your work has been so instrumental in shaping my interpretation and understanding of trauma and how it impacts the human experience and human behavior, I was hoping that we could spend this first bit of time helping other people understand the essence of the polyvagal theory. And I know that that's going to make your eyes roll back in your head. But what I mean by that is I think the concepts of defense mobilization
Mhm.
and co-regulation in terms of our social engagement systems, these
But
constructs have such
let's
incredible
start
relevance.
before we even get there and
Yeah,
really say, what does polyvagal theory, what does it bring to the world of, of basically human interaction, therapy, and even how we deal with our children and our significant others? Polyvagal theory places an emphasis on our physiological state as important. It's an important, what would be called an intervening variable. What it really means is that our physiological state has a great impact on how we process other information and how we respond to it. And we can merely reflect about how some days we're very, in a sense, tolerant. People can say things to us and we'll smile. Another day they say the same thing. We really like we've been greatly insulted and we feel extremely uncomfortable. So, polyvagal theory provides an understanding that our physiological state is an important window, it's a portal into both understanding how we react, but also in helping us regulate how we react. So, when we start getting into these other parts of the discussion, we're really saying if our body's in a state of threat, what's the how are we responding to the rest of the world? So it's not like the actual threat is creating a bodily responses. It doesn't have to. Our body has to go into that response, and then we see the world as threatening.
mm. So talk a little bit about um, threat in particular, especially when you say that the body doesn't have to, there doesn't have to talk a bit about threat in this
We'll go through
context right
because
now.
really let's put in the context of what we're experiencing today.
Exactly.
So whether we don't have to dance around the corner, we can actually stand on the corner and see what's happening. We are in a situation and where our bodies are interpreting the whole world, our whole environment is threatening.
Exactly.
Okay? In our local environment, if we're self-quarantined, there aren't any real features of threat for many people, yet their bodies are in a state of defense, which means they're responding to the world in a very biased way. So the issue is number one, we respond to cues of threat out and we respond to them by adjusting our bodily state to provide us with the resources to fight or flee, or in some cases to basically dissociate, shut down, and disappear. Um, but what we really want to be is in a state where we feel comfortable with another, we feel that we're in a trusting, safe environment. But if our body is triggered into a physiological state of defense, it's very difficult to respond to even to another person who may be successful and welcoming. It may be very difficult to be acceptable to that person. You may be defensive at it. The important point here is that our nervous system detects cues of danger and life threat, as well as safety, outside our realm of awareness. The problem is because it's outside our realm of awareness, we develop narratives to explain why we feel certain ways. So if my body has really detected all these fears going on about the COVID-19 virus, and my wife comes out and interacts with me, and she's not smiling or bubbling and interactive, I will see her as a cause for my discomfort. It's because she's not providing sufficient cues to calm me down, and she's merely being who she is. And I misinterpret it because my body is now in this state that is now going to interpret cues that are neutral as if they're being negative. I may say, "Why are you so critical of me today? What's bothering you?" Because I don't have a clue of what I'm reacting to. All I know is that my body's in a state of discomfort, of destabilization. And what polyvagal theory says is that we know that we can sense our body. It's not the problem. But we're not aware of the cues that trigger us because they occur outside of our conscious awareness.
Mm.
Because if we were consciously aware of them, we'd go into internal debates to decide whether or not they were really valid cues of threat. And then as a species, we would never have evolved. We'd be gone. So the part is that our body's picking up these cues. There's another important point that is seldom discussed, and that is our nervous system craves predictability. It sees predictability as a metaphor for safety. And guess what? We're in a time where there's very little predictability.
Mhm.
And we're getting mixed messaging about what are the real risks, so we can't even build a plan. Our nervous system says, I don't care if you have a problem. I just want to know what that problem is, and then I'll plan a way of solving that problem. So, but if we keep creating a chaotic uh, system or chaotic set of events, we can't develop any predictable expectancy that we can solve the problem. So our nervous system wants predictability and expectancy.
Okay, so I want to stop there for a moment and go back to what you were saying, because you were describing defense mobilization that people are likely to experience right now, partly because of the loss of certainty, but all of the things as well. And if you take that and you imagine someone traveling outside their home and they're encountering people who are now turning away from one another, keeping huge social distance from one another, people are afraid to face each other, there's no more physical contact. How will that impact their autonomic nervous system
Well,
functioning?
first of all,
Wouldn't those
exactly what it's doing.
Yeah,
But let's
but
let's
they might
actually
not know.
place the problem. Let's place the problem as it is. We're under threat of a virus. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that we have to avoid the virus. The issue is in avoiding the virus, we're avoiding people, which is really, in a sense, our biological imperative. We survived as a species, or survived as a species due to our ability to co-regulate and connect with one another. So we're given one message, and that is isolate, and another message, which is what our bodies generate, says you need to connect. Now, we're a smart species, and we know that if we connect, we can basically get the disease. So we now have to connect in different ways. And this is, in a sense, what we're doing today. We're connecting through a video chat. The issue with video chatting is that we're so accustomed to looking at two-dimensional screens without thinking of them as opportunities for a shared moment, sharing a feeling, sharing a presence, being witnessed, experiencing something together. We're seeing it merely as an entertainment vehicle. We watch television, we watch movies, and when we do video chatting, we tend to think of them merely as a conveyance of information. It's like any other meeting. I'll write my notes down. I won't make eye contact. I'll get out of the room when it's over. Now we're really with a challenge. We have this very interesting technology that has face and voice, and it's relatively synchronous, meaning there's not much delay, which our nervous system hates. So we can have a reciprocal interaction, but now we have to pick up the cues that we've been, in a sense, trained or learned over time not to pick up. If we were sitting down at Starbucks having coffee or having a drink, we would be spontaneously interactive. We would be intuitively responding to each other. But once we put the screen up, we tend not to be as sensitive as we could be. So now we have to, in a sense, relearn our intuitive skill set of detecting features from other people, but now doing it from a two-dimensional screen.
So it's an adaptation that we need to make, and in some ways, I guess the question is, are we going to be able to make that adaptation fast enough for it to not cause,
Oh,
I mean, we know that, like, so if we're not able to get the cues of safety that we require in order to help us regulate our state.
okay.
um,
So Emily, there's an upside and there's a downside. Let's get the downside finished with first so we can talk about the upside. Downside is that a lot of people are suffering. And a lot of people are not self-quarantined in an environment that is even safe for them. So there are bad relationships, so there's abuse in the family, there's abuse in children, and that's really basically they're confined to hell. It's not a good situation. And they're not even getting any of the normal safeguards that you would have, even in bad situations. They can't go to the park, they can't go to a movie theater or the mall, they can't get out away from the violations of their nervous system's need for trust, meaning that their own parents or their significant others are really the source of abuse and violations of safety. So that we know, and that's going to be a price, and we're going to have to be helpful to many people in understanding that the consequences of this self-quarantine activity is really uh, isolation, and isolation for a mammal is one of the worst things you can do. It's just not how mammals evolved to be. So that being said, let's talk about the positive things that can happen under these situations. Well, there's a democratization that's going on through the disease, which is really saying it doesn't matter how much money you have, or what your degree is, or how whatever stuff you've accumulated, you're still vulnerable, and it's irrelevant about who you are. You can get it, okay? Which is a very, it's a leveling of a type of playing field. Uh, Now, the real issue now is once we are vulnerable, what do we do with it? What's our true needs? Once we say that the accumulation of objects and stuff isn't our life's goal, what do we start finding out that's important? We start learning that our connections with human beings is really what makes us who we are. So the silver lining is that we're stripping away the false accolades of what we thought was success, and we're really going into our own biology, which is telling us that really all life, the only thing we really want in life is to be connected to others, to have trusting relationships, which is really a powerful statement in our society and culture.
So you feel like this is an opportunity for reprioritization and reimagining, how we function in our social landscape and what we value.
Yeah, well, I actually, over the years, have learned from the trauma world more about being a human than
Right.
I learned from is in studying so-called typicals or normal things, because what you see is what's taken away.
Mm,
And so when people suffer from trauma, what they're really saying is, I want to be able to connect with another person, but my body says, don't go there. And which is really the body's adaptive reaction of being injured by those who were trusted people, which
right.
is really where trauma really occurs, true violations of trust. So we our body learns in a different way than we learn cognitively. Our body learns very, at least term viscerally, and it tells you whether you're comfortable in certain settings. So we learn from trauma that connectedness and desire for a relationship is important, and it's not an intentionality because most of the people in therapy for their traumas have one goal, and that is the capacity. They want to be able to feel comfortable in the arms of another. They
Mm,
want to be able to have that trusting moment, a shared moment of mental and physical and psychological intimacy. They want to feel safe while being connected. And that's been literally stolen from them by the intrusion into their lives that trauma did. I also want to put in at this one point what I've thought about what is it that polyvagal theory gives uh, the clinical world? What
mm,
is the sense of conceptualization? It shifts the personal narrative from a documentary of events to a documentary of feelings. So if we think even in terms of the trauma world, and we're still stuck with this because this is how our scientific Western world, mechanistic world views, it thinks that you can articulate events which are stimuli, and that will determine the outcome, meaning PTSD or any other form of disorder. Well, there are nervous systems that are very resilient that can deal with some of these traumatic events without becoming traumatized.
mhm.
While there are individuals who do something that's relatively casual and their nervous system is so fragile that it gets totally retuned by that joke or that prank or that event that becomes totally humiliating to that person, that they are no longer the same person. So we know that the internal state of that person is a major mediator of what events do. And that's really what polyvagal theory is about. It's
Mhm.
about the feelings and how you can now start talking about interventions as really going in and shifting one's underlying physiological state.
So, so I mean, let's talk about that for a moment. The shift shifting of physiological state and people's resilience, and uh, their autonomic nervous system resilience right now is being really challenged. At least I'll speak for mine. Mine has been significantly challenged in this, and I'm wondering, you know, I'm seeing evidence of others being challenged through social media predominantly. And I wonder if it would be helpful for people to hear from you. What is what happens when we are challenged in our autonomic functioning? What kind of behavior follows that maybe at this point you thought you were friends with people, you thought you knew people, and now they're saying things that are harsh or shaming or judgmental. I mean, there's a lot of that's happening right now, and I think people are feeling like, well, I guess that person's just a jerk because they're not
Yeah,
understanding that
we
there's
can
been a
we
shift.
can walk. Yeah, we can navigate through life, basically talking about vulnerabilities and having compassion, even for those who appear to be jerks, and understand what they are doing. Even many of these adverse behaviors are really attempts to regulate that person's state. It's just not a good. It's not a sophisticated strategy. You don't hurt others to make yourself feel better. And so we have to understand that. But let's go really what you want. You want to, in a sense, frame what's happening to a lot of people.
Yes.
So let's talk really. We're in a sense a quasi, it's not even quasi, we're in a real point of isolation. And for mammals, isolation shifts your autonomic state and moves it into states of defensiveness. Now, what that really means is that when we are safe and calm, our autonomic nervous system supports social behavior, but it also supports homeostatic function, meaning it supports health, growth, and restoration while supporting social behavior. That's why social support is important. That's why witnessing and being present with a person is important, because there's a biological component to the impact of that behavior. Now, when our autonomic nervous system goes into a state of defense, it can go into a fight flight system. And when you're in that system, you lose your capacity to be compassionate, to be empathic, to share feelings of the same moments of shared experiences. The other becomes truly another, and you're no longer connected because your body has now moved into defense away from accessibility. So that defense occurs because the nervous system says, A, I'm too vulnerable. I can't allow someone to come close or I'll be hurt. So the defensiveness works into aggressive behavior, sarcastic behavior, anxiety, mobilization. And that's in a way, that's not as bad as it can get, is really what I want to say. So that's our first level of reactivity is anxiety, mobilization, more of a fight flight, or what people call a stressful time where they're like this, they're mobilized. The real tipping point is not there. The tipping point is when the nervous system functionally gives up and shuts down. And that's where you see people with despair, loss of purpose in life, loss of desire to even live. And it's not a conscious intentionality, it's the body's reaction and interpretation of cues. It's not on a cognitive level. The body goes there. And it may go there if there's no options for escape. And when we're in a point of isolation, if we don't utilize whatever tools we have to connect in different ways, we're going to find people who really have, let's say, lost it. They have been retuned by the experience. They have become withdrawn and feel totally socially isolated. And remember, I used the word feel socially isolated because we have opportunities to communicate through the internet, to see people, and to reach out. And for many people, and this is the experience I'm having, is a lot of people are reaching out. And in a sense, I would say my social calendar is not the way I like it because I like to interact with people, but it's people who want to have these virtual 1 hour videos on the porch, having a beer or a cocktail. And I mean, they're reaching out, and it's almost as if that's all they're doing. And I have other things to do also. So I'm now in this world of having to be very compassionate because when they reach out, I want to be there. I'm going on a virtual birthday party in Los Angeles in an hour. Uh, so it's a part of, we know what's going on and we want to be part of it, but we also have other things to do. So for some of us, there's still a very powerful purpose in life where we're still craving to complete some projects, not for monetary reward and not for publicity, but because it's embedded in our bodies that this is what we want to do.
Mhm.
And that's, I think, true of a large percentage of our species, of humans. We use terms like we want the world to be a better place. Now, what does that mean? It means that we want to be helpful. And going back to the issue of what's the silver lining of this experience, I think we're seeing in lots of people this desire just to be helpful.
What do you think we're going to need to do when they are able to loosen? I guess one of the concerns that I have in all of this is that it's changing social norms, the things that have been in my body's memory associated with cues of safety and comfort.
Yeah.
Whether that's an enthusiastic hug when I see somebody that I care about, or close physical proximity, because I believe that that has therapeutic benefit in
Yeah.
personal and professional relationships. And so I wonder, what are we going to need to be mindful of in terms of those social norms, or to help us with recalibrating those social norms now that we aren't really supposed to do those things in
So I will tell you, this has been an interesting journey because on March 6th, I was in New York City giving a talk.
Mm.
And I was giving people hugs, and which is the
Oh.
way I'm accessible, and if people, if they want a hug, they want a selfie. That's great. I really love that. It's it's a validation of a human being, especially when you see someone smile and they really feel comfortable. Okay, that was March 6th, and I said to people at this meeting, I said, I will give you hugs this month. I will shake your hand, but next month it might be different. Okay.
Mhm.
But it wasn't a month, it was 3 days later.
Yeah.
Well, 3 days later, we were basically self quarantined. And so this became this whole turning around of what it is. And after about 10 days, I started to get antsy and I got on my bicycle and I biked a little. And I decided that that's not safe. It's an electric bike. It goes pretty fast. And I'm a very mature adult. And my adult kids said, don't end up in the emergency room now. This is not the time. So I put it away and I started to think about other things. And I will say that fortunately, I got a new pair of glasses. Um, I normally use what I call Costco readers, but something happened over the past year and there was a asymmetry in how my eyesight's aging. So I went on and got some Zenny glasses. And I'm going to bring this into the story because when I put them on, these are reading glasses. I see your face in great detail now. Now I pick up cues that I wouldn't when the glasses were off.
Um,
So I am now, I am allowing you to be in my space with great detail, and it's helping me relate and to see cues. So I have glasses on, and I will not. I normally don't wear glasses. I don't drive with glasses, but on a computer screen, if I were reading, I put glasses on, and now I'm reading you.
yep.
So I have the glasses on. So I'm attentive to you. It's not like I am attentive by being consciously aware. I'm just allowing more cues to come into my life and to my processing by having more detail. If I were to start thinking about this, it would lose the spontaneity that I hope we have in our interaction.
Hmm. Hmm. So, is there a part of you that it sounds as though, I mean, this is very adaptive, right? That you're trying to already be conscientious about how do I allow myself to be more present with a person virtually? And I
Yeah.
guess that I would just say that I am, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I'm resisting the evolution of our species needing to become virtually adaptive. I mean, I think that, it's here, it's the technology that we have. We're not going to completely get away from it. I've resisted it up to this point, but,
Hmm.
I don't want to see this replace real human interaction. And I guess the
Well,
question, I mean, I guess I wonder for you, do you share that? Do you want to be able to see us come back to a place at some point where we can be,
okay, everything has to be informed. This is where I said our nervous system works best when it has predictability. At the moment, we can't go back to normal because there's no vaccine. And if you're in an age risk and health risk group where I fall in,
mm,
you have to make some life decisions. I have some talks I'm supposed to give in the fall in Europe. I doubt if I'll go there. I'll
yeah.
doubt if I'll actually get into an airplane for quite a while. Now
Mm,
that changes my life because I travel a lot, I give talks, and I love the interactions with people because I both learn and I create relationships. And I'm now having to come to grips with that this is too risky in the world that I'm in. Remember what I was saying, that we have to prioritize the injury. The virus is dangerous, but so is it dangerous not to socially interact. So I need to socially interact. So I need to modify how I do that. I started developing a different strategy to do a online workshop because if I'm not doing workshops in person, how can I make a virtual one, be effective? So I've been discussing that it should have more Q&A, it should have more interviews, and it will have, in the middle, it will have PowerPoints and literally tutorial type, or normal PowerPoint presentations, but it has to be, in a sense, contained within the social interactions of a dialogue. If you
So
don't do that, it won't work.
so I'm curious, I mean, obviously you're in this sort of analytical state with it and you're thinking and you're problem solving, because that's the kind of brain you have. That's the person you are. But are you sad about that? Are you sad about, like, are you grieving that
No, no,
might,
you
like,
see,
because you
it's
are.
that you're learning too much about me, aren't you? Um, because what you're really asking is, it's kind of like these old, crying over spilt milk. There's a problem, and now we have to make the best of the problem. It's not about who we can blame. It's how we can optimize who we are in the problem. And that's who I am. I'm trying to optimize for me with my own being rational about my own vulnerabilities. Now,
Mm,
if I were in my 40s, I might think differently about what risks I would take. But
mm,
again, if I were in my 40s and young kids, I might also not want to take those risks.
right.
So we're really very dependent on the public health system of the country, or in this case, the world. And it really has not done a good job. And because it hasn't done a good job, um, we have to basically fend for ourselves. It's a feeling that thought I'd never have, that we have to take care of ourselves. Well,
Mm.
that's tough in this situation. So what we can do is we can minimize risk, and that's where I'm minimizing risk, and I'm trying to maximize what I need or what I think humans need in terms of their social connectedness. So I'm actually working in my mind about how you would structure a workshop that would be much more effective.
Well,
And to
good. When
make
you
them,
come up with that, you let me know.
well, it has to be more of like what we're doing. Because if people don't see the human being on the two-dimensional screen as being a human, as someone that they can't relate to, if they don't see, excuse me, if they don't see a person that they could relate to, then they're just going to fall further and further away. They have to be attracted to what we're saying. They have to feel like we're engaged with each other, and now they're engaged with us. Then it's effective.
Chris, that reminds me, are there folks that have made some comments or asked some questions here that might be a good time to um, intersperse?
Well, actually, I have one question, and I'm just going to read it as it's written because it's really well stated. It's once again, underserved communities appear to be taking the brunt of this pandemic, whether due to disparities in healthcare, employment, housing, food insecurity, or epigenetics. Where do you see the greatest need when we return to our new normal?
Well, you're really talking about issues of social justice as well, I mean, which is really popping up in the community, in the world of therapists as well, because they see the disparity. Um, I think the whole notion of a social net or a net underneath us is what's needed. And this becomes this whole dialogue that's occurred in the country between a more of a socialist perspective versus a total pure capitalist one. But it's never been really a pure capitalist. There's always been infusion of funds for other projects in which wealthy people made money, whether it was in construction or in military. We need to see that our welfare and safety is health as well. And I've always been amazed that public health hasn't had the same value as an army. And we're seeing the impact of that today because we can have an army, but it's not helpful in dealing with diseases. I certainly hope there's going to be more of a reaction. I wanted to share a moment about this. If we, in Germany, Germany's been hit with a lot of COVID-19 cases, but the number of people who have died is relatively few.
Mhm.
And which is a very interesting thing. I was on doing a webinar with a colleague from London a few days ago, and she was telling me what happened in the not in the UK, in Germany. Merkel basically sat down, literally rolled up her sleeves and said, "We're all in this together," and basically was a very empathic and a sense of a sharing of a national need. And this is very different than what we're experiencing. So I think what's happening in Germany is they feel connected. I think Merkel is helping them feel connected. And what we're getting here is separation, whether it's states and cities, rural versus urban areas, south versus north. It's really a competition without a sense of collectiveness on a government level. But when you start dealing with people, they're really very connected in this country trying to be helpful.
Mhm.
So I certainly hope that there'll be a reappraisal of what the priorities in life are. And having a good public health system and a good educational system. And I think, by the way, education needs to change greatly from a constant evaluation system, which creates basically puts the body into states of defense all the time. So you have great where you would see anxiety and comorbidities and different health issues, but you would see now uh, education as really opportunities for neural exercises where individuals would have more opportunities to co-regulate with each other. We call that play. So if you play together, your
Well,
body's more comfortable.
and it's funny because there are quite a few people on this meeting or in this meeting today that are educators, that are trauma informed educators. And I know that when you say we need to really shift away from having
Mm.
an educational system dependent upon evaluation to determine student success, that they're going, yeah, say more about this, because one of the conversations that's starting to emerge is that this is an opportunity for us to reimagine education, public
Yeah.
education in this country. And I wonder if you want to take a moment to talk a bit about that from a polyvagal perspective. I know we've talked about
Yeah,
that, but
yeah, it's important to me, and I'm really pleased that people who are in the education world are getting a glimpse of polyvagal theory and how it can help them deal with the issues in the classroom. So in the class, what I like to ask the educational systems or teachers is, what would your world be like if state regulation problems didn't exist? And then you had to ask the other question, how much time was spent in your training to deal with state regulation issues?
so when you say state regulation, I'm assuming that a lot of our educators may be thinking that you may mean state regulation related to standards and common core.
No, 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 no.
You mean,
Emotional regulation,
yes.
emotional state, physiological state, behavioral state, disruptive behaviors, oppositional, aggressive, whatever you want to That's what I would call it. Okay.
Right.
So it's that type of state regulation, not state regulations.
Right.
So the part is whether or not the educational system takes it seriously, that if you provide the right opportunities for neural exercises for state regulation, you'll now have children who will be better able to regulate their state to take in the information more efficiently. So
So,
rather than yelling at and constraining or restraining kids on chairs in classrooms, that they have sufficient amount of time to mobilize and to regulate their physiology through social interactions,
mhm.
which
So
creates, yeah,
let's think about that for a moment, because even though you're adapting your life to meet your social needs, there are many children, many of
yeah,
whom we already saw showing up in our schools very traumatized, who are living in these unhealthy
yeah.
circumstances, and they're quarantined in them now. And so when school returns or resumes in some form or fashion, it's likely that we're going to see a significant increase in, well, it may not be aggression, could be shutdown, disassociation, but nonetheless there will be lots of kids, likely to be lots of kids who are struggling. And
Hmm.
so when you say neural exercises, I just want to hit the pause button on that for a second, because that's polyvagal language.
Yeah.
And so what do you mean? Say more about what you mean. Talk about your eye contact and vocalization of physical proximity, because I think that meat is so important for our educators to understand, and the value of that.
And neural exercise is a social interaction that has reciprocity in it. You're listening, you're nodding, I'm talking, I'll wait, I'll listen, you respond. So there's this reciprocity, and this is really the basis of co-regulation of our physiology. If I don't stop talking and you need to say something, you feel physiologically, you feel discomfort. And and so there's a need for an attunement that creates the reciprocity. Therapy does that. Teaching should do that. But what children do is play is that. So play doesn't always have to have vocalization. It has movement, inhibition of movement, role reversal. It has all the principles of co-regulation. And children need to actually do that to provide the neural resources to enable them to regulate their behavioral states in the classroom, as opposed to thinning, in a sense, making it so difficult for children who have, let's say, developmental delays in their regulation or atypical, or let's say they're not compliant in their ability to sit still. They're just excluded from the educational system. They're blamed,
Mhm.
and it's as if they're treated as if they have the if they don't have the that they're acting out because they don't have the intention to be good kids. Many of them really want to be good kids. Their body really starts to get triggered and they have to move, and they get really battered by the system. So we need to create opportunities to provide children with the neural exercises that will then promote their ability to regulate their behavior.
And when you say children, are you thinking across all grade levels, or are you just thinking about, are you speaking to young children?
Well, I think it's everyone.
Mhm,
I would say even adults need it.
mhm,
We need
mhm.
ways of reciprocity. And when we don't have the capacity, I would say we don't have the opportunities to co-regulate, we start losing our capacity to co-regulate.
Mhm,
Now, what is a confusion is people think it's all self-regulation.
mhm,
When the reality is there's a developmental sequence where co-regulation provides the substrate for self-regulation.
mhm.
So we have this myth that if you're too responsive to your child, the child will not be able to take care of themselves. And it's probably the opposite. If you're more responsive and contingent, the child will be more exploratory, more creative, and more self regulatory. So it's a sense we need the co regulation to be able to be self regulators. And all relationships require this type of co regulation.
Well, and I think I've read or heard you say at some point that the version of that a little bit older in life is flirting. And that's a way in which we play as adults, and build reciprocity with maybe a person we don't know well, or to rekindle something with someone that we care about. But
Yeah,
just
we
going
can.
back,
Yeah, let me just build on what
sorry,
you
go ahead.
said. We can deconstruct that and say, what is flirting? We're sending cues of safety to the other person. That's all you really say. We're
Yeah,
using more intonation in our voice. We're using more facial activity, more gestures. We're saying, I'm an accessible human being. You should be accessible. You can trust me. So we're going through this dialogue without words. We're going through a dialogue of interactions. And people need that. We do that with our pets. If you watch people with their
totally.
pets, it's an interesting dance that goes on with that.
So
Yeah.
on that note, if I could just interject, because our participants have been participating in the chat, and we've got a few comments relating to what's going on in homes right now. And
Mhm.
there was one that noted an article that small children and pets are benefiting most from this pandemic because families are forced to be together, and parents aren't going to work. And do you agree with this? And will this lead to more family time? And then there's also some questions about video game play. I have
Mhm.
two teenage boys, so I have my own concerns about this, is what's going on. And so the question is about how video games have impacted children's ability to have relationships and engage in play.
Well, let's go back to your first two questions. The joke going through the internet is that the dogs are the happiest of all now because
It's true. My dog, anyways.
yeah. And the other one is, and I see this in my granddaughter and my son and my daughter-in-law. The whole time is focused around. She's 2.5 years old. She's having a good time, and we're on Skype with her or Zoom, and it's not the same, but she's active and they're there, uh, dealing with her all the time. It's 24/7, no daycare, but they can handle it. At least it appears they can.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming. So the issue is if you have sensitive and well-regulated parents, young children are going to benefit. If you have parents who are on the edge, let's say financially on the edge, professionally on the edge, and their relationship between the two parents isn't as good as it could be, then the kid's life is pretty rough in this small environment
Mhm.
because the parents will want private time themselves because they'll be trying to work or do something or complain. And the child's going to feel basically as someone who is creating the problem. And this will then result in some issues. So the part that the data are, it's going to be complicated because what you're really, the question about whether kids will benefit or not is really a function of the family resource. If the family is a family that has sufficient money that this is not going to hurt them, and or they can work from home and they can kind of titrate their workload from home, then they can kind of adjust and deal with this for as long as the duration isn't too bad or too long. But the issue is children are needy and they want new experiences. So where a 2.5-year-old can feel comfortable playing with a bucket and some water in a playhouse, a 15-year-old is not. Okay, so a 15-year-old is saying, I can't handle this. I need to be with my own kind, meaning my peers, because remember, when you're a teenager, parents are from a different world, and you need to get away from them.
Well,
And this,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, but I don't know how that's going to play out
Well,
because,
yeah, I think the developmental stages do play a big role in this, or how kids are going to be impacted by it. I do believe has a lot to do with their developmental stage. I agree that in healthy families or families where parents have the means to continue to parent in a regulated state, more or less, I think those kids will benefit absolutely from that proximity to their parents. But that's not a lot of that's not necessarily a lot of kids, and that's not necessarily most kids.
yeah.
I mean, I think we're lucky if it's half and half. But if we know that families and children that we used to support were stressed pre-pandemic, there's no question that that's likely to be very strained, and that for families who were doing pretty okay, they're likely
Mhm.
also to experience greater strain. And so I think that that's for young children or school age children, I think well, for school age children, I think it's a tough time. But I
Yeah.
especially think it's a tough time for our teens because developmentally they need to be with their peer group.
Mhm.
To not have that sense of connection and belonging and proximity. I mean, as someone who worked with teens for years, I can tell you when kids don't experience that, it has grave impact on them and their development. And so, I wrote a letter to our governor, Sununu, this past weekend, imploring him not to cancel school for the remainder of the year. But even if he decides to do that, which it looks like he will, I am concerned about wanting, as soon as it's humanly possible, our young people need to be able to have contact with their young peers. They
Yeah,
do.
but what
I mean, that is a biological
yeah,
necessity.
but what you're really saying it's the social component that's critical,
Yes,
and the states with their regulations and the tend to think in terms of the amount of contact hours of
right.
certain subdisciplines.
Yeah.
And what's more important in this case is the contact,
It
the
is
social.
because it's so interruptive to the development, and so
Mhm.
that's trauma. Trauma is what's in what. Well, that can be trauma is what interrupts typical sequential development, and I think prolonged time without peers is a potential significant threat to typical development.
We have to put this within the context of the high percentage of children who are abused within the homes.
Yeah,
The numbers are
they're
high.
hugely high, and I don't
And,
know that people realize that if you don't work in
yeah,
schools or.
and they're higher actually in rural areas,
Hmm.
which is this
Hmm.
almost paradox. It's as if you're not close to other people, your home is your own, and you do whatever you want with it, with spouse and with children.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a dark history of the family that most of us, and I'll even include myself in the story, didn't know anything about. We watched television, got our model of what a family was from television families,
Right.
and then thought our families were just not sufficient because they didn't have all the nice things that were on television. And many people grew up with that, but other people grew up with really the tragedies of what was going on, of these dual lives, a life of being abused at home and then going to school and being normal and not no and not talking about things. And
Mm-hmm.
these numbers are high.
Mm-hmm.
It's well over 25% of the women, and it's
Mm-hmm.
over 10% of the males in
Mm-hmm.
terms of severe abuse histories. This is a large segment of our society. And
Mm-hmm.
the environment that they're going into now is saying, okay, it's all right for you to be abused, just stay inside. Because
Mm-hmm.
that's not, there's no, in a sense, child welfare or child family support going on under
Right.
this setting. It's like you're on your own again. And no one's monitoring you, which is the other thing. Uh,
Right.
and so I think if we sit back or stand back from all this for a moment, we would say that if this thing can really be wrapped up in another month or so, recovery will occur without almost seamless. If we can get the right types of programs in place, which would be almost uh, social rehabilitation is really what you're suggesting. In a
Mm-hmm.
sense, rather than having classes, have social events where people share and talk and interact, kind of almost like a mega group therapy for teenagers where they play. And
Right.
and it is when teenagers get together, they talk and they regulate themselves based upon shared experiences. Let this start occurring and let the school systems and the cities and the state try to facilitate that before it gets paranoid that they haven't gotten the right test scores uh,
Right.
on the standardized tests, which really, for some reason, become more important in the
Yeah.
culture that we're in. So I think we're what in a sense what you're talking about is really what I'm talking about is that during traumatic events or traumatic reactions, we see what is important in our human nature being ripped and stolen, taken from us. And now, as those who are, say, enlightened or at least informed, we know what needs to be put back. We need to create the opportunities in safety for our kids and for ourselves.
So I do have a couple more questions have emerged. Instead of giving them to you all at once, I'm going to skip to this one because it's on the lines of what you were speaking of in terms of violence in the homes.
Mm.
And one of our guests is asking, basically, there are concerns about an increase in domestic violence and child abuse that are going on during the quarantine. How can we find and support victims and get them to safety during the quarantine?
I, 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 I
There's a
don't
million dollar
really,
question for you, Steve.
well, I mean, I don't have an answer for this. I can only support the person asking the question that this is a real problem.
Yes.
And what this really is telling us is that nothing has been put in place to serve the families under this situation. And that's a tragedy because there'll be a great cost to society.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I
Um,
think what I hear you saying, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
no, no, no. I just, as long as we can circle back, I want to make sure folks' questions get addressed.
No, no, go ahead. Keep going.
Um, so I'm going to try to stay with some continuity here.
Yeah.
One of our guests along those same lines is looking for any advice for those working as psychologists within forensic settings and trying to support people in custody.
Hmm.
You're hitting me with questions that are not creating what I would call a reflex response, a reflexive response. Um, the issue of dealing with within the judicial system is that the system needs to be informed
Mhm.
about people's physiological states on all different levels. And I've been talking to some of my colleagues work with judges, and he's trying to inform judges that people who are in custody may be in states of defense that make it impossible for them to defend themselves in the judicial system. So the issue is we have to have great respect for what our physiological state does to us and whether it enables us to be convincing and co-regulatory, or do we just appear to be oppositional and aggressive?
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
I've got another really complex one here for you. This is a great question. So, this is someone looking for suggestions for providing support for. This is someone who works with the deaf or hard of hearing and deaf blind community.
Yeah.
And in
Oh,
these communities, big hugs for hellos and goodbyes are a large part of the culture. Do you
Mm.
have any insights on how to support community cultural needs while enforcing the physical distancing? And then they go on to say separately, the deafblind community is being hit the most hard because physical touch is their main form of communication with anyone ever. Telling the deafblind community that they must physically distance themselves for the duration of the quarantine is essentially telling them that they are in solitary confinement for the duration. And what can we expect to need to support or respond to during and after the quarantine?
okay. So my question on that. So I think that is a profound observation and it's very important. But if we were to mitigate that, what would we do? Would we do things like have therapy dogs? So we enable a co-regulation to occur with someone that's not a person. But the question, and again, this has to do with how poorly informed we are. We don't know if a dog could be a vehicle for conveying the virus.
Mm. Yeah.
But I haven't seen any reports of dogs getting the virus. But the issue is the ability to hug a dog or to be socially involved and have contact with another, what I use the term appropriate mammal, is very important. And if you can't, for the deaf community, since touch is so important, perhaps the ability to deliver rescue dogs or rescue pets to that community would be very important during this period of time.
I think so. I think some of what I'm hearing you say is optimizing what we can virtually,
Mhm.
optimizing, the virtual experience,
Yeah.
paying attention to other people when we are virtually connected, um, I mean, we didn't talk about it, but I wonder what your thoughts on are, or what your thoughts are about social distancing that, can be respectful of how the virus is transmitted, but allows us to, getting creative. And do you have some neighbors, and can you set your lawn chairs out on either side of your
Yeah.
fence, or and making really trying to, because we've been pretty much told to stay in our homes, and I
Yeah.
just feel like that's a,
I
I mean, in
did
some
that.
situations it's necessary because of social density, population density. But like where I live,
I'm in a small community in northern Florida, and 2 weeks ago, I got on my electric bike and I went down and I visited friends, and we sat around their pool with great distance. It was lovely. I did it twice, but after that, I decided I'm not even doing that because this issue about uncertainty and how our nervous system reacts. Because there's not enough information being conveyed about how it's transmitted, and
Mm,
also how virulent it is for how long a period of time. When people say it stays active on plastic and metal for 2 days, you start changing the way you deal with everything. You wash everything down, cardboard, so you don't get a pizza delivered because the box could be carrying it in. So
mm,
you start overreacting because you don't have enough information. And
mm,
this is really what bothers me a lot. So even having Instacart bring things, it means you need to wash everything down. And so we need a better, uh, well, we deserve more information in a systematic way so that we can solve the problem. You're actually saying, let's create social settings. We set lawn chairs where they're 6 feet apart or so. Is that enough? Does that work? Um, in my view, and again, this was my own tainted view in early March, I felt that the probability was so low that I wasn't even going to worry about it, and that was New York City. And that, in a way, was a mistake because there was so much going on in New York City at the time I was there. It just hadn't percolated into the manifested as an active disease at that point because no one had tests. So if you can't test the population, you don't know where it is. And this is another thing that creates this uncertainty. So um, if the we need to know more about the disease to manage our lives within this crisis, and we're not getting enough of it. So self-quarantining only is useful if you can now monitor community spread after you carefully unwrap the self-quarantined people, let them back out so you can track them.
We
so
have
one of
a
the things that,
loaded question for you here, Dr. Porges. Is there a measurement of the positive impact of connection? And could the impact of connection outweigh the vulnerability of the immune system?
oh, who asked that?
Well, it's a good question because
That's a phenomenal question.
there's no doubt that our psychological states, our feelings of trust and connectedness affect our immune system. But we don't even know about this virus, about whether there's a true toxic load model to it, or there's, in a sense, a greater specificity, meaning you get the virus, you got it, versus you get so much of the virus that you can't handle it. We don't know enough about how our body reacts to the virus. Uh, from a naive point of view, we would normally take a toxic load one, which meant that slight touching of it wouldn't bother us if our nervous system is in a positive support out of states of fear. But as we move into states of fear, our body becomes more and more vulnerable to the deleterious effects of the virus. So you, in a sense, have an amplifier of the disease based upon your physiology. So,
Mhm.
but we can't go around and, in a sense, measure everyone's physiology. Oh, you're at low risk, but we don't know how much toxic load they've absorbed. So you have two things going on: the toxicity, the amount of the absorption of the virus, and the state that they're in. There's an irony. One of my friends, who is a well-known person who does martial arts and all forms of uh, Eastern breathing techniques, he got it, and he got very ill. And he was the last person that would expect it to have it. But he had been working with people who had been exposed to it.
Mm.
So the issue is it's hard to know. We don't know enough to develop that strategy. So if the strategy was that as long as you stay optimistic, socially interactive, and feel your autonomic nervous system is out of states of defense, then your immune system is, in a sense, more resilient, then you potentially could handle more of it. But we don't know. And so at my stage, I'm not, or my age, or my vulnerability, I'm not willing to, in a sense, roll the dice.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to be very smart and we have to wait for the information to come in. I think what it really means is we're learning from the states that are the hardest hit and the communities that are hardest hit.
It makes me wonder too how things will be if we end up having to stay in this lockdown state for a much longer period of time, at least as long as
Well,
it's been already.
it's not good. And the earlier comment about racial disparities, like in St. Louis, apparently, which is everyone who died in St. Louis was African American from the virus. And so we also know that financial pressure is going to be on minority groups and poor people, and they're going to be hit harder, and they don't have the resources to be buffered. But
Mhm.
we're doing a survey now. We are actually collecting data, and we're finding out that you have this set of confounding variables that if people feel that their physiology is reactive, meaning that their state is more defensive, they're feeling much poorer with the virus, or not with the virus, with the crisis, than those whose sense of their own body is different. Now it gets more confounded because those who come into the setting with a trauma history already have physiologies that are more reactive.
Mhm.
So you start seeing people with trauma histories really sitting there and being vulnerable to the anxiety and disruptiveness of the virus. And then you have other vectors like financial problems. So you start seeing the systems basically being challenged. So it's one thing to isolate, to stay away from the virus. It's another thing if your isolation creates a whole set of other challenges like abuse and financial crises. And that's the world we're in.
So we're a little bit after 4 o'clock, so we've been chatting for about an hour. And so I think maybe I would love to have you just share with us if you have if you could have one wish, because one of the things I'm thinking about here is that it may not be that we can do all that much that's practical in terms of this circumstance of socially connecting. But one of the things that I keep hearing you say is that we don't have enough information,
Mhm.
and maybe we need to be, and not in a combative way, but I wonder if we need to be leading a voice of advocacy around what do we need to know, or what are the questions we want to be able to ask our officials and our health experts that would help us to have, or help direct them in the information that is shared. Is that appropriate at this point for us to? I
I
mean,
think we
do you think that the lack of understanding is, if
okay, so let's ask this first question, which took a while to get out. How is it transmitted? Do you know how it's transmitted?
do I know how it's transmitted? I've been
Well, yeah, I did. It's not a question. It's
it's a
not.
rhetorical question. Oh,
Uh,
Dr. Daniels is
uh,
in. No, I mean, honestly, though, what I've heard from my medical professional friends is that it's droplet form, is that it's not
right,
aerosol.
but yeah, but what does that really mean? Does it mean someone has to spit on you?
Yes, yes.
Well,
Someone has to
that's.
like sneeze in your face. It has to enter your body through some means.
I think that's one view, and then it's like, well, it doesn't have to. It can stay virulent for 2 days,
But you
but then
still
they
have to
say
then touch it and like, or stick.
maybe, or touch your face or rub your
Yes,
eye.
yes, right.
And then the issue is, it depends on which physician or which scientist you talk to. They said, yeah, that's true, but it's really very small amounts. It's not enough. So now you deal with the concentration, and we don't. What I'm saying is the message isn't clean to me. isn't clear to me. It's enough, the messaging is enough that my wife, Sue, won't let anything come into the house that's not wiped down, and we don't let anyone in the house. So it's enough to trigger her anxieties, which were not the same as mine. Initially, I was fine going to Costco I think we were there on March 14th, and I didn't wear gloves, and she was wearing gloves and all this, and I was eating my hot dog, having a good time, and, because that's what Costco is for me. It's this adventure in life. Uh, but and I was respecting her anxieties because of her own history, her own life, and without saying, "Oh, don't be that way. That's how you feel." I'm okay. I was dealing with how I felt, and I actually think she was probably right. So I basically have taken on a much more conservative view because I don't want to get ill because the people that we know who've gotten ill at our age, and if they've survived, it's been really a tough road.
Mm.
And I don't really want to I want to be around for a while.
Yeah. We
I
want
have
you to be
things
around
to
for a while
do.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have things to do, and I want to see my granddaughter grow up. And
Yeah.
by being silly is that saying, "Oh, I can do it," and then getting the disease is just, I can wait. I can be patient.
Mm.
Um, so I think the knowledge is that we need to know how it's transmitted.
Okay.
We need to know what are the mitigating or buffers that keep us from getting ill,
Yeah.
because there are people who are in contact all the time who seem to be doing fine.
Yeah.
Uh, our discussion at home is we don't know if we are immune to it anyway. We may be, because we were at dinner in New York City with three other couples, and two of those couples got it a few
Mm.
days after. I mean, they were infected while we were having dinner, and we
Yeah.
were fine.
Yeah.
But I'm not taking the chance. If I'm immune, great. But let's get the right types of tests so we can get a better understanding of our flexibility in our society. And I think that's the critical thing. We need to know where we are in terms of this virus. It's certainly not the same as the flu. It's much more virulent, and it's transmitted in a much more aggressive way.
We do have a couple more questions. I don't know if we have time for
Well,
those.
why don't we wrap it, because I feel this
You've
is a
got a
big
birthday party.
day. And it's given us a lot of his time. So why don't we find one more, pick one more question, and we'll finish up with that.
Oh my. Well, there are a couple of folks who've been waiting patiently. So
Oh,
these might be two-part. One person is asking about, since a lot of families are spending time together, is
mhm.
there an opportunity for a system of co-regulation partners? And then another person asked, and this might be a similar, is that a lot of professionals, especially those in education, are learning about co-regulation virtually. And do you have any suggestions or strategies for that?
Well, the first thing is couples, if they're successful as couples, are always co-regulating.
Mm.
They're always role reversing, sharing, and witnessing each other. In education, if we start off by saying that co-regulation requires a witnessing of the other person's state and a reciprocal set of behaviors, uh, talking, listening is really a co-regulatory behavior. Being listened to by someone who is truly present is very co-regulatory and comforting, um, meaning that you're listening to the person without making any judgment. You're allowing them to feel comfortable in emoting. That it's not the words they're saying, it's the feelings that they're expressing. And the real part here is that our bodies need to express ourselves, and the expressions are not necessarily words. We need to get our emotions out in a pro-social way. And sometimes we talk about what pain we're in, but we have no desire for the other person to feel that pain. We just want to be witnessed.
Mhm. And so, just going back to that question, because it makes me think that really I hear you saying, in terms of education right now, probably the two best things that our educators could do, if they can, is to encourage our their students, our kids, to either
Mm,
be playing with one another virtually, like
yeah.
not playing video games, but actually finding ways to interact virtually, and or giving them safe space to talk about things, you know. And
That's
I
right.
know that that's not, you know, teachers get nervous about that. They're like, well, we're not therapists, we're not trained that way. It's just being real. It's just being like, even acknowledging it's okay to feel dysregulated. It's okay to feel,
They're
yeah.
modeled, by the way, now because in New Zealand, the earthquakes disrupted the kids there. There's a lot of children with traumatized features in the school systems. And if your educators trying to deal with the effects of more of a global or community trauma, look at what's going on in New Zealand, where they're trying to rehabilitate the children and providing them with cues of safety.
Mhm. Dr. Porges, I'm so grateful. This was so great. This was awesome. And I don't know, maybe I'll need to have you back again when we're still sitting at home 6 weeks from now.
Oh,
Figure out how things are going then. But I appreciate your time. If we could give him a wave goodbye so he can see how much we appreciate his time. And
thank you so much. Appreciate getting to interact with you, Emily. Thank you.
yeah, it's great.
And
Thank you so
good,
much.
good discussion, and stay safe, and
Same to
make
you, please.
make good life decisions and interact the best you can under these circumstances. Take
Thank you.
good care.
Thank you. Take care.